A human choosing to give a portion of their income, should that be a personal choice or more of a moral obligation?
Well, it depends on whether you're speaking from the perspective of a moral theory. Utilitarianism, let's say. It would be morally wrong even to not donate to help others. But
there is almost a bit of a guilt associated with choosing to have luxury things when you know those funds could be used for a much better outcome. Do you feel that you can be a good person and have nice things? What do you think makes a good human being?
I think a good human being...
One of the stats that I think is quite interesting, the value of a statistical life. How much money would we spend in Australia to prevent someone from dying? That number is $5 million. And if you compare this to prevent someone overseas from a disease like malaria, that only costs $5,000. Because of these radical inequalities in the world, we could maybe do up to 100 times more good by donating overseas.
Is that happening now? Is that...
How does that work? It sounds like a science fiction movie.
Actually, it's happening already. So AI...
If you kind of shine the light on yourself, you can think more holistically. You can think, well, I might preference my family or something like that, but I can also do a job where I can, contribute more broadly or earn an income, and how can I make a difference?
I think that's a really good point.
But one of the tests says, how would you rate the intelligence of a cow? And if you've told them in advance that they're going to get a beef for lunch, they will give a lower opinion than if you've told them that they're going to get a vegetable dish for lunch.
That's so interesting.
Just 40 years ago, apparently most doctors in the United States and United Kingdom do surgeries on infants without anesthesia for the reason that they probably won't remember the pain.
If you could save one person you know or reduce the suffering of 100 people you don't know, which one would you pick?
Well, I think I ought to pick...
For me, I think it has to be.
It just illustrates that this stuff is complicated too.
Hi everyone, welcome to More Than Good by Effective Altruism Australia. Today we are joined
by some incredible guests where we will be discussing what does it take to make a good human being. Today I'm joined by Krystian Seibert, who is the Executive Director at Philanthropy Australia. He is also on the board of Mental Health First Aid International. Also joined by Grace Adams, who's the CEO of Effective Altruism Australia. Peter Singer, who is a moral philosopher and author of multiple books, including Practical Ethics and Animal Liberation, and Yip Fai, who is a researcher on AI and animal welfare. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone.
Pleased to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Peter, we'll start with yourself. In your opinion, what do you think makes a good human being?
I think a good human being considers the interests of others, and that doesn't only mean other humans. I think we have to extend that to all sentient beings, so animals, insofar as they are or might be capable of feeling pain and suffering. We should give that some moral weight, and we should think about the consequences of our actions. Again, not just immediate ones, but maybe also as far as we can predict into the future. But of course, as human beings, we are also animals by nature. We have our own nature. We have evolved to be animals who care for their offspring. Otherwise, they wouldn't have survived and evolved. And so I think having strong relationships, family connections, is part of what we are. And we can't and shouldn't really try to suppress that. But we should try to think beyond it to that much wider framework, and think what we can contribute to the world as a whole and all sentient beings, as well as also being close with our family and having the things that humans need to have to thrive.
Faye, do you feel that a human choosing to give a portion of their income, should that be a personal choice or should that be more of a moral obligation?
Well, it depends on whether you're speaking from the perspective of a moral theory. So obviously there are moral theories, including probably Peter's view on donation might say, well, from utilitarianism, let's say, it would be morally wrong even to not donate your money to help others. And as Peter said, it might not be just humans, it includes all sentient beings that you could help with your donations, with your money. But we also need to worry about or take care of the fact that saying such things might be unhelpful in encouraging people, or maybe even encouraging yourself to make a donation. If I say to myself, it is wrong if I don't donate it, it's, well, to some people, maybe not to myself, not to any particular listener, but to some people, it might be discouraging that the motivation for donating is not a positive sounding thing. So for some people, it might be more encouraging and more effective to keep donating if they just say the positive thing. And if that's a good motivator, maybe there's a practical reason. Well, I wouldn't say lying to yourself, but framing the reason for donation in another way instead of focusing on whether you're committing more wrong by not donating. Some people are indeed functioning psychologically that way, and I would say, yes, if that is what would motivate you to do more good, try to think in another way. I wonder, Peter, if you might agree with that.
I think for many people, yes. The idea that actually making a positive difference to the world is something that adds meaning and fulfillment to your life. And again, we are purposive animals, so I think that's certainly true. So I think there's a lot to be said for putting this in a positive way rather than saying you're a bad person if you don't do this.
Yeah, one of the ways that I like to frame this is around like a moral opportunity, maybe rather than an obligation, where people have an enormous opportunity to do good through their giving, and doing so can add a lot of meaning to one's own life and do a lot of good. And so that's one of the framings that I like to use to have that more positive sense rather than an obligation.
Can I add a little bit about the moral theories, such as utilitarianism? So
yeah, please.
Actually, even from a utilitarian perspective, it could be wrong to use a wrong narrative or wrong kind of framing to yourself or when you're speaking to others, to blame others for not fulfilling their obligation to donate. Because if this strategy is ineffective, it is exactly wrong according to utilitarianism to do such things. Even speaking that to yourself within your mind, I guess, it is not effective, just don't do that. If you do that, it might even be wrong to say that kind of thing.
What about helping others? I'd love to know your thoughts on this. Do you think it should be a moral obligation to help other people?
I think in general, we want to cultivate societies, and this has implications for the sorts of institutions that we create and nurture, where people do want to practice and express solidarity, support others that might be in need, but also contribute in other ways. And I tend to think of giving and donating as like an act of democratic participation. We often don't think of it that way. We sort of think that when you're participating in democracy, you might be voting or, writing a submission to an inquiry or something like that. But when we're donating to particular causes, we're participating in a kind of collective decision-making around the sorts of things that we want to fund and change in society. And so that's also a different frame of reference. So you can have sort of the frame of reference around, say utilitarianism about sort of, the greatest good for the greatest number. But then there's also the frame of reference around that it's good to cultivate and nurture a healthy civil society where people participate, where they engage, because that participation and engagement, it has value in and of itself as well. And admittedly, this is something I'm influenced a lot by because of where I was born. I was born in Poland in 1982, in a country during a time when there wasn't a free civil society. So I think it's something quite personal for me in terms of the way I look at donating, giving and helping others.
And that applies to career choices too,
Sure.
I suppose, right?
I think it absolutely does. And, when we're making career choices, we consider so many different factors. I considered sort of the factors that I chose to go into my career. And I think we're also seeing that a lot of younger people want to consider sort of not just, which industry, who might pay them, but also if they are, say, working for a company, say, a for-profit company, they want to work for a company that is a, responsible corporate citizen that's contributing to the community in other ways beyond just sort of selling its services and products.
Grace, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So a lot of the recommended interventions involve sending funds abroad instead of to Australian charities. Can you please explain why that is the case?
Yeah, absolutely. So Effective Altruism Australia, we do tend to recommend charities, or all of the charities that we do recommend in global health involve sending funds overseas. And this is because people that live in low and middle income countries are, much worse off generally than we are here in Australia. And so one of my core beliefs is that, everyone's life is equally morally valuable. And if that is the case, then, we should want to help others regardless of where they live. And because of these radical inequalities in the world, we can do much, much more good if we are giving overseas than if we give here in Australia. We think that's probably, we could maybe do up to 100 times more good by donating overseas. And so that's one of the reasons that we want to send money overseas, because we think that we can do much, much more good. So one of the stats here that I think is quite interesting is in Australia, we use this thing called, or the government uses this thing called a value of a statistical life. And so this is basically how much money would we spend in Australia to prevent someone from dying. And so that number is $5 million. So according to the government, we would spend $5 million to protect or to prevent someone from dying across their lifetime. And if you compare this to what it costs to prevent someone from dying overseas from a disease like malaria, that only costs $5,000. There's a radical inequality between how much money it takes to prevent someone from dying. And I think that's one of the starkest kind of contrasts as to why we should send money overseas.
That's a really interesting point that you raised. Do you feel that if people knew how many deaths their money could prevent, that we would live our lives quite differently? Because these are not things we really think about, right?
We don't want to think about them sometimes.
Or don't want to think about it, right? But I feel if it were more common knowledge and people genuinely had very tangible figures around how many people literally their dollars could save, I really think a lot of us would live very differently.
Yeah, I agree. I really think that if people understood what these numbers were and that, $7,000, $5,000 could prevent someone from dying from an easily preventable disease, that really would reshape the way that we think about things. But obviously this is a very big focus of Peter's work over time. I know that Peter's essay, Famine, Affluence and Morality, was a big kind of, milestone in how I thought about this and for many other people. Peter, did you have something you'd like to say on that?
Yeah, sure. I think part of the problem is, you talked about the value of a statistical life in Australia, and that's right. But so what that means is we don't know whose life we'll be saving. For example, we're putting in traffic lights at an intersection where we can predict that one person will be killed every 5 years, let's say, but we don't know whose life. And this, when it comes to donating for bed nets to prevent children getting malaria, we also don't know whose life we can save. We can say statistically, if you donate 5,000, it's likely that you've saved somebody's life, or possibly you've saved two. But that makes a difference. And in the article that you mentioned, Famine, Affluence and Morality, I illustrated that difference by this story of walking past a shallow pond and seeing that a small child has fallen into the pond and is apparently drowning. And you could rescue that child just by getting your clothes a bit muddy, maybe ruining your most expensive shoes that you put on because you're going somewhere special. But if you ask people, would they do that? They will really all say yes, right? Of course I would rescue the child. How could you compare a child's life with the cost of the most expensive shoes? But then that child is right in front of you and there, right? And then what you're asking, and I'm asking through organisations like The Life You Can Save, to say, do this for somebody far away who you can't see. And emotionally, that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
I would say, ethically, it doesn't make a difference. And in terms of what we were just talking about before, about, yes, you're doing something meaningful about saving lives. It doesn't make a difference whether the child is in front of you or far away. But that's what we've got to get across, and we've got to get across to people that they shouldn't only be pulled by their emotions. Of course, they should have compassion and emotions stirred up by seeing a child in danger of drowning, but they should also think about other children who they don't see and who therefore don't have the same pull on their emotions.
And I think it's one of the strengths of effective altruism that it kind of, in this way, illuminates some of these dilemmas and questions and prompts sort of thinking and some awareness of these judgments that we make, and sort of that they can be subjective. And I do think that, one of the sort of challenges is that, humans are also kind of communal creatures. And so we do care about our immediate community. And I think it's always that balancing of the sort of, we're going to care about our immediate family and maybe the people who might live in close proximity to us. And those that we don't have contact with around the world, and that's changing as well as more people travel and spend time overseas, etc. So that can be sort of a countervailing sort of force, I suppose, there.
Yeah, the travel overseas doesn't always work well, though, right? I mean, people get attracted to projects like an orphanage, for example, and they want to do something for the orphanage, and they don't really have the kind of detailed investigation. Is this a bona fide orphanage? Some of them are actually buying children from parents who are alive, and that's what you need, sort of the effective altruism work and those organisations that are going to do an independent investigation of which are the really effective charities.
And I think that analysis and independence is really useful because, there's so many choices that we've got to make when we're giving. Especially that figure you quoted, Grace, around sort of the $5 million, like that, it's always chilling when we hear that sort of thing, and it's used for cost-benefit analysis when they're sort of determining whether to adopt a policy intervention or not. But it probably doesn't include what governments spend on, the democratic process, the courts, the health system in that broader sense, because, which goes back to sort of that point I was making too around investment in institutions that kind of create the conditions for healthier, more inclusive societies. And we know sort of, got to be careful to not sort of, be colonial in this sense that in, certain countries, and I speak about Poland, the institutions we had when I was born, they're very different to the democratic, more inclusive versus extractive sort of institutions we've got now, and sort of the impact that's had on various outcomes.
Peter, I have a hypothetical for you. If you could save one person you know or reduce the suffering of 100 people you don't know, which one would you pick?
Well, I think I ought to pick saving the 100. Whether I actually will probably depend on how close and I am to the person I know. I'm sorry, there are probably plenty of people I know who I would be prepared to let go in order to save 100 strangers, but there are also maybe some that I wouldn't let go.
What about everyone else? What would you pick?
Oh, for me, I think it has to be. It has to be. It depends, right?
Yeah.
I think. Much like Peter, I would love to say that I would save 100 people instead of that I don't know, instead of one person I do. But if it's my partner or my parents or my brother, maybe that's a tougher conversation. But I hope no one listening or watching this that I know comes back to me with questions about which list they're on.
I'd say my partner and my kids, and but I think it just illustrates that that this stuff is complicated too, and sort of proximity relationships matter. But also, I suppose, extending that thought experiment, if each of those 100 people have someone close to them, and if they're prioritising the welfare of each of one of those, and we know that's not always the case. Some people don't have anyone that's prioritising their welfare. How do we kind of, what kind of impact does that cumulative sort of caring for our family and friends have, and how do we do it in a way that kind of, we care about our family, but we also care about our community and society and the global community as well?
Absolutely. Faye, how has your definition of doing good changed over time, or has it changed over time? And if so, how has it changed?
It's certainly changed. And oddly enough, before I started engaging with the ideas and then the people within effective altruism, I was already, well, at least I claim to be, and I believe I was a utilitarian, but I wasn't thinking of doing good in terms of maximizing the amount of good I can do. It's just, I was still, oddly enough, just thinking about doing good as in I could just do enough and stop there, which was frankly not quite utilitarian, but engaging with the idea and people within effective altruism still shifted a utilitarian or proclaimed utilitarian back then to really think hard about how I can do more good. And maybe not just that, I wasn't, when I was trying to think about doing good 10 years ago, or actually it was like more than 10 years ago, I just had the rough idea that maybe I can, well, it was something like earning to give, but my idea back then was trying to succeed in a company in China, doing some high-tech stuff. And I thought as the research development director of that department of that company, I could just get rich and then I will do some good to the world. But I didn't even think of what cause I would donate to or what thing I would do with that kind of money after getting rich. I just had the rough idea, yeah, I would first get rich and then something will happen. But engaging with the idea of effective altruism, well, eventually led me to do effective animal advocacy and joining an organization called Mercy for Animals, which I worked for 3 years, and then I left because I decided to do something that is probably even more neglected, which is AI's impact on animals. But yeah, before engaging with effective altruism, I guess I was a bad utilitarian, you would say. Yeah.
Well, and not fully practicing utilitarian, perhaps.
Yes, which is not...
Which many philosophers are like that, right?
Yeah, which is not uncommon among utilitarian or proclaimed
Unfortunately,
utilitarian
not at all.
philosophers or ethicists. But yeah, so short summary is that my ideas on what counts as doing good or how to do good did evolve quite a bit over years, and it keeps. I hope it doesn't stop here.
Yeah,
it will
of
keep
course,
improving.
keep learning, as Krystian said.
Right, keep learning.
Yeah, well, and I think what's so great is to have these kinds of frameworks to explore some of these questions, because I'm thinking back to that sort of dilemma you posited before, and about thinking if you kind of shine the light on yourself and you have to think about those things, you then think more. You can think more holistically. You can think, well, I might sort of preference my family or something like that, but I can also do a job where I can contribute more broadly or earn an income to help. So you can think then about, well, more broadly, what's the package here? Yeah. And how can I make a difference? Yeah. Whereas if you're not asked the question and not challenged to kind of think about it, you can maybe just avoid having to sort of think about your purpose in life, how you want to contribute.
It prompts that thought. Yeah, exactly.
I think that's a really good point. I think that they're, feeling like, your family are the most important thing to you doesn't mean that, you can't spend your time working on global problems or donate just a portion of your money to areas that are really, really impactful. I think sometimes when it comes to doing good, people fall under this impression of, well, it's all or nothing. And if I'm, not doing all of these things, then, then it's not worth doing. And that's just not right at all. And I'd really love to see more and more people really take the approach of doing what they can and stepping up their ambition to do more over time as well. Because I think these things are somewhat of a virtuous cycle. Once you start to take positive steps or, think about how to have more of an impact, the next steps become easier.
Right. And so there's a sense, and some philosophers are talking about this, that we should move beyond the black and whiteness of right or wrong and instead move to the idea of that there's a scale, bad and good, if you like, and we should be trying to move up that scale to being better.
Yeah, and if we look at how we learn and change often as humans and societies, it's rarely sort of through like a all or nothing big bang. I mean, there are external shocks and things that, change our own lives, societies, etc. But often, you know, it's small changes over time around the edges that add up over time. And that's why I like the kind of, you know, give what you can or giving what you can. Like, you know, you might just make a small change, give a bit more, or, you know, yeah, I'll join that board as a volunteer and contribute. And hopefully, you know, over time, all that sort of adds up.
Do you feel that you can be a good person and have nice things? Because there is almost a bit of a guilt associated with, let's say, choosing to have luxury things or spending on luxury when you know full well that those funds could be used for a much better outcome. So what do you guys feel about that?
I guess my take on this is I think you can be a good person and have nice things. But, you know,
Just
well,
checking.
audience probably.
at the end of the day, I do think, you know, we do have to balance, like, you know, what we do spend on versus what it can do. I think it's unrealistic for people to kind of, you know, spend down their, you know, personal kind of income to the point where, you know, they're living in poverty. That's probably not a reasonable expectation. And I think it's, you know, as part of normal society, you know, the expectation is that you can go on holiday sometimes if you can afford it, or, you know, you can go out to dinner with your friends and enjoy a nice meal. I think all of these things are fine. But, you know, the more that people are able to give or contribute, this also does have a positive impact. And we should weigh that carefully and think about whether the purchases that we make are driving meaning in our lives and are driving value for us, and weighing that up with the impact it can have in the world.
I guess it's very subjective on a very person-to-person level, because everyone would have different views in terms of what is reasonable spend or what is within reason, right? Like, it would vary vastly.
And I think there are different approaches to this, so I imagine everyone might have different views.
Yeah, and of course people have very different standards for what they mean by nice things and what they're prepared to spend money on.
Exactly,
Right?
yeah.
I knew people in New York who would think nothing much in the New York winter of flying to Thailand for a weekend. Yeah. And of course, you know, they weren't flying economy either, obviously, right? So, you know, I mean, that's a lot of money to have a warmer weekend in the winter, right? And there are other things that you could do that probably would be just as enjoyable or very close to being just as enjoyable. And for the cost of that, you could save a life or maybe 2 or 3 lives. So I think there's a limit to how much expensive indulgence one can really engage in and think of oneself as a good person, given the world, given the fact that there's 800 million people in extreme poverty by World Bank standards, given the amount of factory farming and the things that we could do to reduce animal suffering as well. I do feel sometimes when wealthy people tell me about the things that they're doing, that's kind of obscene in the context that we are.
Absolutely.
And there's always that paradox too, that you've got that additional nice thing, you know, happens to me all the time, that you want to get, and, you know, you get it and it's okay. Like, you feel a bit more happy afterwards, but you don't go, I finally got this. I've got this, you know, house or this car or something. Even I'm happy now. Like,
It's just that idea of getting it, and then once you've got it, it's like, oh, okay.
yeah, and there's research showing too that, you know, that like, you know, there's that people sort of, you know, think if I just had a percentage more income, then I'll have enough. But then they get that and they think that they want more as well. And, you know, there's also, you know, there's the whole sort of background, the evolutionary background to that in terms of, you know, wanting to keep sort of striving.
Exactly. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it always at play. Peter, I have a question for you. So we know that animal-related causes always rank less than children-related causes or human-related causes when it comes to donor preference. And we know that millions of animals are suffering in factory farming right now in Australia and globally. Why do you think there's this disparity in the scale of suffering and where we choose to give?
Well, I think, you know, Krystian was just talking about our evolutionary background, and clearly we have evolved to love children and take care of them. The extension to animals, I think there is actually some extension, but it's particularly to our companion animals who we know as individuals, the dogs and cats. So if you really look at giving to animal charities, even within that category of animal charities, from an effective altruism point of view, You find the shelters that look after stray dogs and cats actually get most of the money. And yet the number of animals that they're helping is tiny, maybe a few hundred and maybe a couple of thousand even, but that would be a lot for a shelter charity. Whereas you can really effectively help a lot of animals in factory farms by promoting alternatives and not buying from factory farms, and trying to get some of the big brands to say that they're not going to use factory farm products, or not going to buy eggs from chickens in cages, for example. All of those things have been shown to be highly cost effective, but because people don't care as much about chickens as they do about dogs and cats, you don't get as much money for promoting something to get hens out of cages.
Do you feel it's a relatability problem in the sense that we've all grown up with dogs and cats, so we understand their emotions and their personalities, so there's some feeling there and understanding of them having moral personhood, but then we don't extend that to chickens because we may not have had that exposure to them. And I feel very blessed. I had exposure to chickens growing up, so I understood their personalities and their social networking and all this kind of stuff. Would you say that that's probably one of the biggest issues in modern society?
I think it is a factor, yes, that people are exposed to see their companion animals as individuals, and they know them, and they don't think of all of these hens that are producing their eggs as individuals, or pigs or cows or whatever else it is that they're eating. But they are individuals, and absolutely they're comparable in intelligence. Certainly, pigs are comparable or superior intelligence to dogs, and I think it's also partly that it is the fact that they know they're going to eat it, and that leads them to lower their estimate of the capacities and personality. There's actually been good psychological research done here in Melbourne that shows that if you tell people as part of an experiment, and they don't know what the experiment is, they're doing various tests or whatever that have nothing to do with it, but one of the tests says, how would you rate the intelligence of a cow, let's say, and if you've told them in advance that they're going to get beef for lunch, because that's part of the program, they will give a lower opinion than if you've told them that they're going to get a vegetable dish for lunch.
That's so interesting. Yet we know that a pig is the equivalent of a 3-year-old human child in terms of intelligence, so that's...
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of differences, of course, and nuances, but yes, they certainly can learn a lot.
But it's also interesting to think about sort of, like how attitudes have shifted, even in, like we use children as an example of how we sort of respect children and their autonomy as individuals, but going back 100 years ago, children were, not really considered as autonomous individuals until sort of they were older, and they were often considered sort of like a form of like property, and therefore, there was no consequences for sort of the various things that parents and others would do to them. And that changed so dramatically. So maybe sort of, over time that would change as well, even more with
and actually, and it's not only, giving them autonomy, but it's also quite acute physical pain. I think Fai has a story, a personal story about that.
Already.
Yes,
yeah,
okay, go ahead.
Just 40 years ago, apparently most doctors, Western doctors probably, in the United States and United Kingdom, do surgeries on infants, like young infants, without anesthesia. And it was found out by a devastated mother whose baby had a heart surgery, apparently without anesthesia. And the mother basically led a movement with a few other doctors and bioethicists who had an issue with this, and started a global movement that basically changed that thing within 2 years. But it was a huge moral mistake before that. A lot of anesthesiologists, including, I believe, the one who started really the field of anesthesia or anesthesiology, he kind of justified not using anesthesia on infant for the reason that they probably won't remember the pain. He actually didn't say they won't feel pain, but he said something like, even if they can feel pain, well, he's sounding not so confident that they can have them. But even if they can feel pain, they won't remember it, which is bad moral reasoning. And like, why does it matter that they don't remember the pain? The pain happened. Well, and I do believe they almost certainly do feel pain. And it was a bad moral mistake that was only fixed by a global outcry started by a mother.
Yeah, because people didn't really know about it, and it was like a moral blind spot, but it was a pretty common practice. And I'm
Yes, and
sure it
every
happened in
doctor
Australia
prior
as
to
well.
that was happy about. And well, they also used the fact that it's risky, anesthesia is risky to all humans, but especially risky to infants, as another way of justifying that. And it's also costly, probably. But we should be able to easily see this as a moral mistake that we should be glad that we went over. And I was actually probably one of the infants who had a surgery without anesthesia, because my report of my surgery for hernia, I believe, my mother's report is that I was taped on the operation table.
You were taped down, so you couldn't move.
With adhesive tapes, and I actually got bruises all over my body after the surgery, presumably because
you were in
just,
pain.
Yeah, I struggled and just shook myself against the tapes, and
Wow.
this suggests that I was probably one of the victims of such surgery, and that surgery happened in the year of 1986, which was the year when it is about to change. I guess I got unlucky. So, but I'm glad that we got over this moral catastrophe. And
thank you for sharing that and your
then
experience.
there's probably a lot more other moral catastrophe that we don't see as even a moral problem, including issues like factory farming. But I'm sure there might be a lot. And I have to say, the issue of under anesthesia in surgeries is still happening in a lot of poor countries where in some countries, there are only a few anesthesiologists in the whole country. And usually in those countries, it is the nurses or the doctors who fill in the role of the anesthesiologist. And because they feel unconfident about the doses, they usually tend to underdose the anesthesia.
And in general, for pain relief too. I mean, that's another thing we've been talking about, saving lives. But we can also very cheaply prevent people feeling severe pain because they simply don't have the drugs that we would take to prevent or reduce the severe pain. And that's another inexpensive thing we can do.
And markets don't work that well to sort of allocate these sorts of things, and markets reflect the inequalities in society. And and speaking, you sharing that story and that research as well got me thinking, I sometimes think about this, what sort of things are happening now that we think are acceptable or that we tolerate that in 20 or 50 years' time we'll look back and go, how did we ever allow that to happen? And sort of I try and rack my mind about what that is. And I think that's also one of the sort of benefits of the effective altruism approach, to think about those things that may not be thought about that much or enough because they're just not given attention.
What do you think the number one thing would be 20 years from now?
I don't know. Maybe we can open it up and then they'll give me time to work it out.
What does everyone
I think there's
think?
a lot of very smart people thinking hard about that. I mean, I think that, one of these topics will kind of be potentially AI and the sentience of digital minds. I think it's unclear as to whether that is going to be the case, but I think it's certainly a possibility going into the future. And if digital minds are sentient, then that poses a number of major questions about what we should do in the face of that.
It certainly does, but on the other hand, we're not blind about it, right? Because we are thinking about it at a relatively early stage where, most people would say we don't yet have digital minds, digital consciousness. A small number of people think maybe we do. But we are talking about it, and Anthropic, for example, has appointed somebody to look into that very question. So I think we might still go in the wrong way and we might get it wrong, but we're not doing it without even considering, as I think we have been, so on animal issues and factory farming, we didn't even consider it until the last 50 years or so.
And what would you think, Peter, like in 20 years from now, when we look back, that we'd be shocked that it was legal?
It's hard to predict now, right? Every one of us here could be still making major moral mistakes or like major mistake in moral reasoning. But yeah.
Yeah. Again, it's not a blind spot, but I think people will look back on what we are not doing about climate change. I think they'll think it's absolutely atrocious that we just continued to use fossil fuel and to eat meat, particularly meats that have very high greenhouse gas emissions, despite the fact that really we knew and that we were damaging the world for our children and grandchildren.
It's a hard one because if I've been thinking about it, it may not be as much of a blind spot. I think there's a lot of in the space of, say, as you talked about, Peter, like AI, where there's like maybe not a response yet, or we don't know what to do necessarily, but we are thinking about it. Because I often think about, for example, I'm 43, and so I was already an adult when social media emerged, but I can sort of look back sort of 10 or 15 years ago when I didn't have all these apps sort of buzzing at me and kind of giving me those dopamine hits, etc. And we think about the impact on sort of younger people's minds and what impact will that have in the long term. And obviously in Australia now there's a social media ban that the government's instituted, and other countries are looking at that too. But I often think about that. How will that play out?
Depressed, shorter attention spans. That's the direction it seems to be going, especially when you've grown up with social media. It is, from what I've seen, it is changing how people feel in a very serious way. Krystian, I have a question for you. So in India, there's a mandate where all companies have to give 2% of their profits towards corporate social responsibility. And this is across the board. Every company has to do that. How do you feel that would play out in Australia if Australian companies also had a mandate to do the same with their profits?
It's an interesting question. I think that if we sort of had a debate about that in Australia, there might be sort of some views saying, well, why aren't they just paying more tax so that then the government, through the democratic process, which, I'll say this is that can often be a simplistic way of framing it, that the government's democratically accountable, so then what the funds are spent on will be, good. We know that's not always the case, but that they should pay that 2% should be taxed, and then government can determine how that's spent. I think that there are things that can be done that sort of, go halfway to that. So I was appointed to the Productivity Commission for its inquiry into philanthropy, and one of the recommendations we made in our final report was that there should be greater transparency around corporate donations in Australia to charities. Like if they just had to report annually about how much they've donated to which charities, that then provides information that, their employees might find useful, that their shareholders and other stakeholders might find useful. And there is evidence to show that companies follow other companies. There's a sort of a peer influencing effect here. And if you have transparency around that, if that information is made publicly available, which company is going to be which large listed company in Australia is going to want to be at the bottom of that league table when, there's stories about how much they donate towards, charities and particular causes every year. And I think, there's things you could do like that, better reporting around corporate social responsibility activities, because, that 2%, a lot of it will come down to, well, what's included there? Yeah. How do you measure it? How do you verify that it's actually sort of, benefiting the community, that sort of thing. But, I have heard about that, but I think, where I'd start in Australia is just having some basic public reporting on listed companies. We can start with them, how much they're contributing to charities and other organisations, and see where it goes.
If I can jump in there, I'm involved with this new organisation called Profit for Good. People can read about it, profitforgood.com. And we're trying to, in a way, rather than have a law that requires companies to do, every company do it, to encourage more companies to do something that is more significant than that. So starting off with some companies like the Australian ticketing agency, Humanitix, which is 100% profit for good. The two Sydney guys who set it up founded a charity specifically to own that company, and then they've been donating on to various other charities helping people in extreme poverty, like The Life You Can Save, and all of their net profits go that way. Profit for Good isn't demanding such a high standard, but it's inviting companies to pledge to donate 10% of their profits as a minimum, and we will build a community, we hope, of companies doing that, who will talk to each other and exchange views on what are the more effective ways to donate and encourage others to move higher. I think there's a huge potential there. A rough estimate of corporate profits globally is $10 trillion.
Wow.
So at the moment, companies give about maybe 1% of that, $70 billion, but you know, they could easily give 10%, many of them, and that would create a huge pool. And given that official government aid is now falling, basically most countries are cutting that back, following, unfortunately, the US example. And yes, individuals can give, and wealthy individuals can, like Gates and Buffett have done just, you know, a great deal of good. But the company sector seems to have been somewhat neglected, not entirely, but so we're getting more companies globally to try and sign on to this commitment to give at least 10%, and then there can be a benefit for the company because, you know, we'll give them a logo to say that they're a profitable, good company, and we hope that consumers will be sensitive to that, and employees, we know, like to have more meaningful work, and so they like to work for a company and where they know that they're contributing to helping people in extreme poverty or protecting the environment. I think there's potential for a much larger movement here.
And any company can be involved in this in Australia?
Any company can be involved. We've had debates about, you know, would we take a tobacco company, for example? Would we take a coal miner? I think the answer, we haven't actually...
Meat company? What about
a what?
A meat company.
A meat company. Well, an agribusiness company that's running factory farming would be in the same category.
They can
certainly.
give 50%. That's their minimum.
I don't know. So we haven't specified because we found it too difficult, and we're going to say, if we get these companies wanting to join us, we'll look at them in detail on a case-by-case basis. But we haven't rejected anyone yet, and we haven't, because we haven't had an application from companies in those areas.
Grace, I have some findings from a study that I wanted to read out to you, okay?
Sure.
So there was a study that was done, UC Berkeley, where it was found that households earning under $50,000 have been found to give 3 to 5% of income, while very high earners often give close to 1 to 2%, excluding ultra-philanthropists from this. And overall, lower income individuals were more generous in controlled experiments, even when the money was scarce. Why do you think this is?
Yeah, I think that this is a really interesting finding. So this particular phenomenon is like often called the U-shaped giving curve. And we know that this research is coming out of the US, so I don't know if it holds for Australia. But my theory as to why we see this U-shaped giving curve is that low-income earners, particularly maybe in the US where there is less of a social safety net, can actually see the benefits of charity in their everyday lives, right? They might be being helped by local organisations and feel more of a pull to kind of give back to their community where they're receiving benefits. Whereas those who are on much higher incomes probably don't see the charities working in their everyday lives and don't necessarily receive a benefit for it. Now, I don't think that we should give to charity based on whether or not we receive a benefit for it. But I do think that that is one explanation for why we would see that kind of curve. And I don't know whether this holds in Australia, but I'd be very interested to see if it did.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think that, you know, you're extending your sort of your thinking about that you know, in those lower income households and in those groups, it can be like giving to charity is like thought of kind of a way of like, you know, social insurance or mutual aid. You're helping each other. And we saw sort of, you know, say, I think it was in Greece during the sort of its economic crisis around 10 to 15 years ago, sort of, you know, the rise of sort of mutual aid amongst those doing it tough in that time. It wasn't sort of those with wealth giving, it was actually people and communities who were doing it tough giving to support each other through those difficult times. And I think, I'm not sure how it sort of plays out in Australia. The vast bulk of sort of the tax concessions for incentivising giving sort of fall sort of to those higher up on the income scale, but the levels of giving sort of, lower down at the income scale are still very high. But what we're seeing generally in terms of the shifts, more or less in Australia, is that giving is increasing, but less people overall are giving, which is concerning for a whole host of reasons.
I wonder if another explanation might be related to how people think about whether they are doing enough good in terms of absolute amount that they're donating instead of the relative. So we might think it seems obvious that the rich people should be donating a high percentage of their income, but perhaps they are just thinking of, the fact that they're just donating much more than the poor people, even by just donating 1% versus 3% of the poor people's donation.
Yeah, I think the Americans actually foster that with their statements that America gives more foreign aid than any other country in the world, which is true if you're talking about dollars.
Absolute terms.
But yeah, that's right, in absolute terms. But if you look at the percentage of the gross domestic product that the US is giving, they're actually pretty close down the bottom. They're along with a lot of countries that are much poorer than they are. Not that Australia is doing very well either, I have to say, on that relative scale. But so that gives you the idea that, as long as you're giving enough in terms of dollars, then you're fine. And I think Fai is right. We should be thinking about how much can we afford to give and how much can we benefit others given the resources we have and still live very comfortably ourselves.
Fai, can you please tell me, how do you feel AI will impact animals? If you can briefly explain that, because we touched on it before and I'm just curious what.
Yes, we just gave a talk 2 hours ago. So let's do a few or maybe a couple of easy examples. So usually I start with the example of self-driving cars. Well, actually, as a matter of fact, a lot of self-driving car designers, like the two major self-driving car companies included, they care about hitting cats and dogs and large animals for the reason that if you hit a cat or a dog, you might get onto newspaper or even face a protest against them. And if the cars hit large animals, it might cause damage to the car and maybe even injuries to the passengers on the car.
Increase insurance premiums or something like that. Yeah.
So they have economic incentives to teach the cars to not hit these animals. Well, not saying they're doing well detecting or avoiding injuries to these animals, but at least they did something. But we have found no evidence that they care about other animals. But if all animals deserve some moral concern, and there are a lot of animals that cars could be hitting, and there are a lot of roadkills in Australia, I believe, too, right? It's the first time I'm here in Australia, but that's what I heard. Supposedly, a lot of those animals might feel something when, if the hit is so hard that they get killed, maybe the harm is that they get killed. But sometimes I saw animals being hit and just not dying on spot and just suffer for a period of time before dying. That happens quite a lot. Either dying or being injured that they suffer for a period of time. I think that's a reason why the self-driving car company should pay some concern to those animals and try to do something about it. How exactly, I'm not sure, because we cannot possibly realistically ask the car companies to design the cars to stop for an animal every time there's a minor risk. It might complicate things if they start caring about insects, right? Basically, self-driving car might stop driving. But at least I think there's an opportunity for AI control cars to do slightly better to begin with, and then gradually better and better than human drivers in terms of protecting animals. So that's
right. But I think the other real concern is AI running factory farms,
yes,
which is happening and is affecting much larger numbers of animals.
Yes, typically
is
that's
that
the
happening
more
now?
important.
Is that like a...
right?
What does it mean? What does it? How does that work? It sounds like a science fiction movie.
Actually, it's happening already. So AI, it's not complicated AI, not even close to the complexity of large language models we have now, let alone AGI. It's just pretty simple machine learning algorithms that can let the system tell from a video camera image or sounds, whether an animal is sick or about to get sick, or they can track individual weight gain. First, they can identify the individual, which is pretty hard for chicken farms that is run by human farmers. It's impossible for human farmers to just identify the chickens individually. But apparently AI start to be precise enough that they can identify the individuals and track the weight gain. And they don't need a scale to tell the weight. They can just see the video of the animal and just estimate the weight, that sort of thing. And that helps the management of the factory farms. It helps them reduce costs. It also improves the accuracy of feeding so that they save on feed costs. It's doing all sorts of things, and they're trying to extend the frontier of using AI for all sorts of things related to factory farming. Even outside of the farm, they are using AI for selective breeding, more precise, more targeted selective breeding, so that I suppose maybe they want even faster.
They certainly want faster growth, but they also want to pack more chickens or pigs into the sheds, right?
Yes.
And if AI shows them a way to do that and maintain or increase profitability, then AI is going to do that. That's really, I think, one of the major problems. Apart from the fact that it may make factory farms more economically viable in the face of competition that I hope will develop from plant-based alternatives or cellular meat.
A number of countries are paying subsidies. The governments are paying subsidies to AI companies or startups to build these kind of systems. China, Indonesia. In fact, recently, the United Kingdom government actually announced a grant on that, I believe. So it's not science fiction anymore. It's happening. Well, it's gone on to the commercial stage already. 2 or 3 years ago, it's more like small pilot projects, but it's real. Like it's in actual factory farms now.
Right.
I suppose there's the also added element of, we're using AI so much more in so many ways, but that requires, the data centers, the energy draw for all of that, water and everything like that. And if these things are sort of, fixed in the amount that's available, or, if you need energy, well, you can use the sustainable energy sources, but there's non-sustainable energy sources, the broader kind of picture there. One thing I always think about too, when I'm sort of, asking ChatGPT a question or something like that, is that I'm on the free version of it. There's no price for me to ask it a question. Even if there was a 0.5 cent cost for each question I ask it, I'd think about it. I might go, well, this is a pretty good question I want an answer to. I'm going to ask it. But, if it's completely free to me, I'll ask it silly questions that I just want an answer to because I can't sleep at night. But that's probably not a good outcome, because I'm then not factoring in the wider cost of this.
Though I think the amount of electricity that you consume, if that's what you're talking about, is actually, per question is
that huge.
Absolutely tiny. And if you go out, if you say, I'm not going to ask you a few questions now this afternoon, and then you go out and order a burger for dinner,
That's a good point.
You've dwarfed the amount that you save just by eating that burger, that you could have asked a lot of interesting questions and maybe got some useful answers.
And it's absolutely true. But if I'm thinking like this, it might be negligible, the amount of energy that's being used to answer my question about sort of a movie script that I asked it the other day. But if everyone else then is thinking that same way, because the incentive structure is what it is, then I suppose cumulatively it could add up over time. Yeah, but I'll take your point though, that
it'll add up to something
relative to other things that it's negligible what the cost is, but then I'll go and eat a burger. Yeah.
The general lesson might be that a lot of industries are not internalizing their costs on other sentient beings, including humans and animals. Like factory farming is just the greatest example of this, not just to the environment, but to animals, obviously. But if there is a way, I don't know, I am not an economist or politician, but if there is a way to internalize a lot of external costs to other beings, it could be part of the solution of improving.
So there's a supermarket in Amsterdam which is called the True Cost Supermarket. And when you go in there, there's a sort of price for whatever it is, And then there's additional external cost. And the price that you pay at the cash register is the total price. That's the true cost of it. And then the surplus, which is the additional external cost, is calculated at the cash register to go to a charity which is relieving or offsetting this cost that you're imposed by,
that's very
buying whatever
interesting.
it is. And it is actually a viable commercial enterprise, which I think says something for Dutch people or Amsterdam citizens, right? That they're prepared to do this. They're prepared to pay this. I think it tends to be between 15 and 20%, the external costs they're talking about. And they're prepared to go and pay that and keep at least this one business in operation.
Interesting.
My sense is, though, that people in Amsterdam are maybe a little bit ahead of where we are in Australia.
Slightly.
Market.
Slightly.
All of the products that are vegan or vegetarian very clearly on the shelf.
Gluten-free, do they label them?
Good question. I didn't look at that. But yeah, I wonder if, these sorts of initiatives could be, I would love to see them be successful in Australia, or at least attempted.
I think they could be. It might depend exactly where they're located in Australia.
We should be Collingwood, I think.
Collingwood, Fitzroy, somewhere around that, maybe in Melbourne, yes, and equivalents. Yes, so it's interesting, but I agree the Dutch are pretty advanced. In fact, this Profit for Good idea I mentioned started with a conference in Amsterdam last year, and my co-organizer in that is Dutch. So I think they are pretty far ahead on questions about altruism and being prepared to do something for the world rather than just for their own pockets.
Does the supermarket also factor in the external cost to animals?
I think it does actually, but I don't think it sells factory farmed animal products, if I remember rightly.
Oh, I see.
Don't quote me on that. I guess I'm being quoted anyway. It's on these
It's too late. Cameras quoting you.
Yeah, but I could be wrong. Let me just say that. Yeah.
So, Krystian, you're on the board of Mental Health First Aid International. I'm usually, when I'm speaking to younger people, and this is something I was really interested to ask you about, especially given what you do, I see a lot of young people really stressed, okay? And young people obviously care about the world. They care about the wider world. They care about their community. Yet when we're on social media, on Instagram, it's very overwhelming. And people feel a lot of anxiety about our brains are just not equipped to deal with looking at whether it's stressful things happening overseas or violence, and then jumping to some ad for something nice, and then a dog video, and then our brains are just not equipped for it. So how should young people deal with such anxiety, climate anxiety, and so many other forms?
Yeah, well, and it's young people. It's not just young people. I mean, to be honest, I sometimes feel that way. Because
You're not a young person?
Depends on your perspective, 43 now. But like I was saying earlier, 20 years ago, I had a phone where, like, if I wanted to send a message, remember the character limits when you wanted to send an SMS, as they used to call them? And now, what you've got at the touch of a few touches of a button, it is overwhelming. And I think that, we all respond in different ways. But I think, there is, a lot of research showing that, the impact on young people and their minds, like even I've got children, if I want to turn the 6 p.m. news on, I'm sometimes like, I don't know if I should, because of the sorts of things that they'll see on it. I think with all these things, it's always a case of, what can we do that's within our control? Because, I'd like to change maybe sort of, what's coming through on the social media feed, what they show on the news necessarily, let alone actually not have those things happening that they have to show. But there's limits to what I can do until I sort of acquire some superhuman powers. So I think about what can I control, and also how, I think this is sort of the benefit too of, mental health first aid, understanding sort of, the origins of anxiety, of various mental conditions, and what we can do to sort of, cultivate our own well-being and that sort of thing. And I've learned so much from a mental health first aid course in that sense. But I think helping young people to sort of understand that they can set boundaries, to question whether something's real or not real. They don't have to, open that app, and that maybe if they are scrolling through that app, what's going on there? There's sort of things happening in their mind that are making them do that. So question that, because I think ultimately, we can only do so much to sort of within what we can control. But I think it's a real challenge, it's a real dilemma, because a lot of these challenges with mental illness they've got systemic causes. So there's limits to sort of what we can do in terms of responding individually to them, but we still have to try and respond as best we can.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the American psychologist Jonathan Haidt makes a very strong case in his book, The Anxious Generation. We had him on the podcast that I co-host, The Lives Well Lived, sometime last year, I think. And I thought it was very powerful. It's particularly small girls than boys that it affects, the teenage girls. The amount of time that they spend on social media, and some spending 7 hours or more per day on social media, correlates very well with their mental health, poor mental health.
And his research and writing has been sort of something that's partly led to the social media sort of ban in Australia as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah. It's interesting because I remember sort of years ago, sort of, the social capital scholar at Harvard, Robert, I forgot his name, that, was looking at the sort of decline of social capital in communities. And, he sort of found correlations between the rise of television viewing and the decline of social capital over time. And it's interesting because, now since then we've had the rise of social media and how that would, have an impact on sort of, the time we spend, participating in a group or a club or something like that. So, yeah. Nothing's changed.
Robert Putnam, I think.
That's it, yes.
Yeah. Right.
Pete, I'd like to read out one of your quotes that you once said. You said that speciesism is a prejudice or bias in favour of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. Can you explain this?
Yes. I mean, I use the term speciesism to make the parallel with racism and sexism, which we're perhaps more familiar with. And, how would you define a racist? There's various ways, but one way would be saying that they take more seriously the interests of other members of their race than they take of people of a different race. And so, if it comes to saving lives, they will save the lives of people of their race, and they won't worry about if there's a famine in a country where the people are of a different race, that doesn't trouble them in the same way. So I think that's a reasonable account of what's wrong with racism. It's failing to be impartial about a really irrelevant characteristic, because, what matters is how much people are suffering. It doesn't really, and, maybe you would not say whether they're good or bad people, arguably. That wouldn't be particularly my view, but you might. But what race they are, clearly I think we can all see that's irrelevant. And similarly with sexism, that, if it's a man or a woman whose interests are at stake, shouldn't in itself make a difference. But what we don't see is that we are just like that with species. And it's very clear that we are, that we do things to non-human animals, like putting them in factory farms, which we would never imagine doing, even if we don't want to eat humans, but okay. Take experimentation, which is another example, right? We perform painful and lethal experiments on animals, which we would never dream of performing on humans. Maybe the Nazis did, and we condemn them for having done it. That's a horrible thing to have done. But we accept that with animals. It's going on right now while we're talking. And I think that is a bias in favour of the interests of our species and allowing them to override the interests of other species, even to the extent that, it can be quite a trivial human interest that we allow to override very serious interests of animals. And again, that's true with what we eat, that the interest we have in eating animal products and eating meat as compared with plant-based meals is really, not very large. I've been a vegetarian for 50 years and a vegan for the last part of that. And, you know, I enjoy my food as much as I ever did. It's different. You get a little bit of, you know, adjustment. But the difference in, you know, there isn't really a difference in my well-being. And yet people will just still go out and buy animal products from factory farmed animals without really giving any weight to the fact that they're supporting an industry that causes such a vast amount of suffering.
And what you just said is human-centric speciesism, but you make a distinction between this type of speciesism and another type, right?
Yes, sometimes speciesism is actually also related to animals that aren't just human, as with the dogs and cats we were talking about earlier. So again, people will, you know, imagine you walked into a huge shed and it was filled with dogs, and the dogs were, you know, extremely crowded and didn't really move around, and the mother dogs producing these puppies were confined in ways that they couldn't even turn around, let alone walk a few steps. You know, you would be absolutely horrified. And yet people who would be horrified by that are buying pig products, pork, bacon, ham, from pigs who were kept in exactly that way.
Then gassed to death.
Yeah, and then gassed to death, which is not a humane end.
Yeah. Do you think that that stems from just a lack of empathy?
I think there's more to it than just that. I think there's a habit of what people eat and a reluctance to change that. I didn't realize when I was writing Animal Liberation 50 years ago that it would be so difficult to get people to change their diet. Even when you've told them, you know, not everybody knows about factory farms, but a lot of people do. And I've had people say to me, yes, you know, I know it's wrong, but I just enjoy eating meat. And, you know, maybe they think there's more enjoyment, but I think they're just reluctant to change what they're eating. And perhaps also they're reluctant to stick out and say, maybe among their family and friends, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go to that place, with that restaurant with you, because there's nothing that I would want to eat because it's a steakhouse or, you know.
Well, as they say, the hardest part of being a vegan is other people. And that's so true.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah,
it's
But even
true.
that's changed over the last 10 or 20 years in terms
That's
of, you know,
true. Yeah,
understanding
that's
or
true.
labelling. Like, you know, I remember what it was like 15, I'm not a vegan, but I remember what it was like 15 or 20 years ago.
You might be when you leave
Well,
us.
you know, it's certainly a lot of, you know, cause for reflection. But, you know, when I think about sort of when somebody said that they're a vegan sort of like 20 years ago, it was like, oh, you know, like, whereas now, you know, at least the labelling and, you know, is very, it's different. So it has shifted, and I know a lot of, you know, people who are vegans, yeah.
So, guys, I have time for one last question, which I'll open up for everybody. How much do you think a well-earning Australian who can afford an overseas holiday every year, afford a nice house, etc., how much do you think, what portion of their income should they be giving to charity if they wish to do so?
I mean, I would love to see people in that position giving 10% or more of their income.
Why 10%, Grace? Where did you get to that number from?
Yeah, so for many years...
Not 11%. 9.5.
So for many years, I worked for an organisation called Giving What We Can, which promotes a pledge called the 10% Pledge. And so the reason that 10% was chosen was that there are kind of like clear historical standards for giving that amount. So giving 10% is very, very common in Christianity. Giving a portion of your income is also popular in many religions, Judaism, Islam. And so 10% had a good standard and is also a significant amount. We know that most Australians are giving far less than that. And so it represents a really meaningful increase on the amount that people are generally giving. But I think for people in a position that can afford an overseas holiday every year, it's actually not a very strong material sacrifice for someone's standard of well-being and the amount that they're actually able to enjoy their lives. I think that many people would be really, really surprised to find that they could donate 10% of their income and really feel that the quality of their life hasn't changed very much at all. I took the 10% pledge myself back in 2021 and have now given over $50,000 since that time. And I really feel that my life is better off If I think about all of the good that money that I've donated has done, I think that is so much more powerful than having gone on more holidays or done any number of other things. Interested on everyone else.
Well, and that's the point too there, that we
11%.
don't always talk about, that, giving, it can feel good too. Because I think that it is a participatory act, participating in the community in a different way. It's an interesting one because I'm thinking, what number would I pick? And I don't want to just kind of give a cop-out answer where I say, it's complicated and there's a whole range of different factors. But then honestly, I don't want to just pick some number that's like random. But I was doing some sort of just looking up some data before this session, and I saw that that our giving to charities as a percentage of GDP is about 0.6% of GDP is given to charity, and I was thinking that if you look at how that spreads across people on different incomes, I'm not sure where that'll land, but imagine if it was at 1%, that would be, and if we gave it to, effective charities and that sort of thing, how transformative it would be. And so I tend to think that can pick a number, and 10% does sound good for me, but so does 5%. It depends where someone's starting out. I tend to think if everyone just gave, 10% more than they're currently giving, or 20% more, and then over time they constantly think about how much they're giving, then it would create, a transformation. But also, often when people go talk to their accountant, their financial planner, or someone like that, it's pretty rare that they ask them, you're selling a business, or this is, have you thought about donating to charity? There's incentives for that, etc. If all of those professionals were sort of just asking that question, that would potentially get more people to think about it as well.
It will usually always be, where else do you want to invest this money to create more money?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that, when someone's selling a business, they'll say, have you thought about these structures, etc. They won't think, well, have you thought about donating to charity, setting up a foundation and, that sort of thing. So I think it's a whole range of different things that we need to do. But I realise I haven't actually nominated a number, but,
We have Grace's 10%.
5%,
5%, 10%.
5.5%.
5.5, 10.
You want to go next?
Not Australian, but I guess, 10% is a pretty good recommendation to give from the perspective of I guess that's a movement building thing. But it's good that the EA movement is giving something that is achievable, sound reasonable to people, but also it doesn't sound like anything like 8.8%. That is not random, but it's also not too precise. But it might not be enough if people want to do more. Certainly, there are great reasons to do much more than that.
Yeah. So my answer, this may sound a bit evasive. My answer is, I would say and recommend whatever figure would lead to the greatest total amount being given. Right, but we don't really know. I mean, 10%. I guess the founders of Giving What We Can, Toby Ord and Will McCaskill, were maybe thinking that is the amount that will raise the most. And certainly, Giving What We Can has been very successful in getting pledges for people and getting actual donations in for a very good sum. You would probably know better than I would exactly where you're at in terms of the value of those pledges.
I think it's over $400 million donated since.
So that's pretty substantial, and that suggests that 10% is a good figure. But if somebody could convince me that if I said the answer is, let's say, a quarter of your income for that well-off Australian who can afford the overseas holidays, and if that would raise more, there would be fewer people donating, but they would be giving 2.5 times as much, and that would raise more, then I would recommend that figure, because they can certainly still afford it and still have a good life. But it also works the other way. If by recommending 5% or even 1%, you were going to get, twice as many or 10 times as many in the case of 1%, or 11 times as many it would have to be to get more. That would be the figure I would recommend. I wouldn't actually think that for myself, when I think what I should give, that's a very relevant consideration, because I'm addressing myself and it's in my power to give. And so I would like to give more than that, and I do give more than that 10%, and more around 25 to 50%.
So Peter's answer is
depending
give
I'm
what
doing.
you can.
Yes, give what you can, and you can feel happy giving and feeling that that's meaningful. And you don't have to make, at least in my income situation, I don't have to make really tough sacrifices in order to do that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It's been a fantastic conversation, and it's been very illuminating. I've learned so much today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.